She didn't yell, she didn't flinch. Karoline Leavitt simply responded with facts, and it was enough to leave a sitting congresswoman speechless on live television. The makeup artist dabbed the last bit of powder on Karoline Leavitt's cheek as the producer signaled 5 minutes to air. She didn't flinch. Her eyes were locked on the stack of annotated printouts in her lap, pages lined with yellow highlights, red scribbles, and bullet points scrawled in pencil. She wasn't nervous. She wasn't even excited. She was ready. And that made people uncomfortable. In the adjacent dressing room, Jasmine Crockett laughed loudly into her phone, scrolling through Instagram while an assistant adjusted her blazer. She was in full performance mode, voice high and animated, comparing the upcoming debate to taking candy from a toddler. She made sure the door stayed cracked open, just wide enough for the sound to leak out. Karoline heard it. She didn't react. That's what made her dangerous. They hadn't spoken yet. Not really. A brief hello in the hallway, civil but chilly. Jasmine didn't like being challenged. She especially didn't like being challenged by someone younger, more methodical, and unshakably composed. She had underestimated Karoline once before on a smaller panel. Not tonight. At least, that was the plan. Inside Studio B at News North HQ in Austin, Texas, the control room buzzed with last-minute coordination. The show's moderator, Greg Sanders, leaned toward his mic. Stand by for live in 3, 2. A red light blinked to life. Good evening, America. Tonight on The Final Word, we bring you a much-anticipated debate between Democratic Representative Jasmine Crockett of Texas and Republican strategist Karoline Leavitt. Tonight's focus: federal education policy, spending, and the growing divide in classroom priorities. Karoline adjusted her mic. Jasmine flicked her hair back and offered a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. The lights were hot. The air was still. And even though the cameras had just gone live, something told the crew that the real heat wasn't going to come from the stage lights. Back in the green room, just 20 minutes earlier, producer Nadine Calloway had briefed both guests. Keep it clean, keep it sharp, and keep it tight, she said, handing them the debate structure. Jasmine, you open. Karoline, you rebut, standard back and forth. You'll each have a closing statement. Karoline nodded silently. Jasmine, without looking up, asked, "And what happens when one of us tells the truth and the other pretends to have read a book?" Nadine smiled, forced but professional. "Then the audience will decide." That tone had colored the air since their arrival. What neither woman said out loud was that this wasn't just a panel. This was a test of composure, of strategy, of public pressure. And for Karoline, it was an opportunity to show what preparation really looked like when challenged in real time. Outside the studio, a small group of interns hovered near the hallway monitors. Some were fans of Jasmine, drawn to her bluntness and boldness. Others admired Karoline's focus and refusal to grandstand. They'd watched clips of both women before, but none of them had seen what was about to happen. Karoline had spent the afternoon in a small conference room near the studio, surrounded by silence. She didn't scroll. She didn't rehearse talking points aloud. Instead, she mapped. She took each likely argument Jasmine might make and wrote down 3 sharp, verifiable counters for each. Numbers, examples, headlines, budget breakdowns. Her mind worked like a wiretap, recording everything in and filing it by relevance. Meanwhile, Jasmine breezed through hair and makeup, cracking jokes about viral clips and comparing previous panels to playing chess with a pigeon. To her, the fight was already won. But there was a subtle difference tonight. Karoline wasn't trying to win the fight. She was waiting for it to come to her. When the countdown hit 0 and the panel opened, both women wore the same smile. But only one of them meant it. Karoline knew what was coming. Jasmine thought she did. That difference would change everything. The stage was lit evenly, but the contrast between the two women sitting across from each other couldn't have been sharper. Jasmine leaned back in her chair, confident, one arm draped over the armrest. Karoline sat upright, hands folded loosely in her lap, expression calm, eyes steady. Greg Sanders gave the floor to Jasmine. "We've got schools across this country with no books, no counselors, and classrooms that haven't seen upgrades since the 90s, she began, voice steady, rehearsed. Yet we're still cutting funding because folks like Karoline think trimming the budget builds character. Karoline didn't flinch. Jasmine continued, tossing her hand in Karoline's direction. It's always the same game, slash spending, push blame, and when the system breaks down, pretend it's the fault of bad parenting or local mismanagement. It's hypocrisy dressed up as policy. Polite applause from the studio audience. Greg turned to Karoline. Your response? Karoline glanced down for a split second, then met Jasmine's gaze. I think we agree that our education system needs help, she said calmly, but where we differ is on how we solve it. Throwing billions at broken systems without oversight isn't compassion. It's malpractice. Jasmine leaned forward slightly, ready to interrupt. Greg raised a hand, giving Karoline the floor. In 2022, the federal education budget was nearly $80 billion. Ask yourself, why are outcomes getting worse? Why are fourth graders in districts with the highest per-student spending still falling behind? This isn't about denying funding. It's about accountability. There it was, calm, pointed, undeniable. A few heads in the audience turned. Jasmine laughed softly, microphone catching it. That's rich coming from someone who's never worked in a classroom or had to look a hungry child in the eye. Karoline didn't react. Actually, I spent a year working in community outreach for a Title I district outside of Tulsa. I've seen it. I've walked those halls. That's why I know pouring money without structure won't fix what's broken. Jasmine's smile faltered. Karoline continued, we can't keep blaming the system's failures on funding gaps alone. We have to be honest about what's working, what's failing, and who's afraid to say it out loud. The tone shifted. Not drastically, but noticeably. Greg felt it. The studio got quieter. Jasmine's eyes narrowed, her fingers tapping her notepad. Then came the jab. So, let me get this straight, Jasmine said, voice thick with sarcasm. You read a couple budget sheets and visited a school once and now you're the education whisperer? Karoline tilted her head, not annoyed, just focused. I'm not claiming to have all the answers, but I'm not dismissing facts because they don't fit a soundbite. Jasmine waved a hand. Oh, come on, Karoline. You're cherry-picking numbers and pretending to care. Now it was Greg's turn to shift in his chair. Karoline leaned in slightly, voice still low and measured. Congresswoman, I'm not here to perform. I'm here because millions of parents are tired of watching debates like this, where we shout over data and ignore real outcomes. That was it. That was the first moment people leaned closer to their screens. It was a quiet kind of sting. No name-calling, no shouting, just clarity wrapped in confidence. Jasmine opened her mouth again, but Greg cut in. Let's stay on the topic of spending outcomes. I am on topic, Jasmine said, sharper than before, because the real outcome here is that people like her keep pushing policies that hurt real families. Karoline's tone didn't shift, and I think real families are tired of hearing slogans instead of plans. The audience let out a low murmur. Even through TV speakers, it hit differently. At home, social media teams clipped the moment and uploaded it before the commercial break even hit. In group chats and Twitter threads, people were already typing, "Did you just see that?" But Jasmine wasn't done, and what she did next would take everything up a level. Jasmine leaned forward, eyes locked on Karoline with that polished, practiced grin. Her voice dipped just enough to sound casual, too casual. You know what your problem is, Karoline? She said, half laughing. You read a few spreadsheets, memorize a couple talking points, and think that makes you qualified to lecture the rest of us. Karoline didn't move, didn't blink. She waited. Jasmine raised her voice a notch. I've walked through schools where teachers are buying supplies with their own paychecks. I've sat with mothers who work 2 jobs and still can't afford aftercare. And here you are, pretending you understand their pain because you've skimmed a policy paper. The studio grew still. It wasn't just an attack. It was personal. A calculated attempt to paint Karoline as out of touch, privileged, and dismissive. Greg's mouth opened slightly, unsure whether to step in, but Karoline didn't give him the chance. She straightened her posture, barely, and looked Jasmine dead in the eye. Congresswoman, with all due respect, you don't know a thing about what I've lived through. The tone was different now, calm but edged, not angry, anchored. I didn't grow up with a silver spoon. My parents weren't politicians. They were small-town workers who skipped meals so I could finish college. I've held 3 jobs at once.
I've cried in parking lots because I couldn't afford rent. So don't you dare tell me I don't understand struggle just because I came prepared." Silence. Even the crew behind the cameras paused. The grip standing near the lighting rig let out a quiet "damn" under his breath. He wasn't alone. Karoline's voice stayed steady, no theatrics. "And let me tell you what struggle really looks like. It looks like a single mom in McAllen trying to teach her son to read because the school keeps sending him home with broken Chromebooks. It looks like parents in Fresno being told their kid with learning challenges will have to wait 6 months for an evaluation." She flipped through her notes, fast but precise. "This isn't abstract to me. I've spent the last year visiting those schools, sitting at those kitchen tables, listening to what they're begging us to fix. And every time I go back to Washington, I hear the same excuses dressed up as speeches." Jasmine shifted in her chair. A camera light blinked. Greg looked toward the control room, unsure whether to cut to break, but this was too raw to interrupt. Karoline wasn't done. "You say I read spreadsheets. You're right. I do. Because behind every dollar is a kid falling behind while we bicker about who gets credit. And frankly, I'm tired of it." Then came the moment. The sentence that would be clipped, shared, and dissected across every platform before the hour ended. "You don't get to dismiss the truth just because you don't like who's saying it." No shouting, no finger pointing, just a perfectly balanced hit wrapped in reason. Jasmine opened her mouth, but nothing came out. For a second, the room held its breath. The weight of what had just happened settled over the stage. Greg finally cleared his throat. "We'll be right back after this break." As the cameras faded, a buzz rippled through the studio. Technicians exchanged glances. Producers whispered into earpieces. And somewhere in the far corner, an intern whispered to no one in particular, "That's going to be everywhere." But as the lights dimmed and the show cut to commercial, the real drama had already started, off camera. The second the cameras went dark, Jasmine whipped off her mic pack like it was burning her collar. She leaned toward the edge of the desk, voice low but sharp enough for anyone nearby to hear. She thinks one story about her broke college years makes her the spokesperson for every family in America? Karoline didn't respond. She calmly removed her mic, set it neatly on the table, and glanced toward the floor manager for direction. No flinching, no reaction. Greg, still seated, rubbed his forehead and let out a slow breath. "Let's take 5 people." In the shadows of the studio floor, production assistants began shuffling papers and checking feeds. One of the editors, Kevin, turned his laptop to show his colleague what had just gone live on Twitter. A 19-second clip. Karoline, still seated, delivering her now viral line, "You don't get to dismiss the truth just because you don't like who's saying it." The caption? Karoline Leavitt just cooked Jasmine Crockett live on national TV. Within minutes, it had over 60,000 views. Inside the control room, the director, a sharp-eyed woman named Rena, who'd seen a decade of live shows, shook her head. "She didn't even raise her voice," she said. "That's what's gonna sting." Back in the hallway outside the studio, a crew member handed Jasmine a bottle of water. She took it, but barely sipped. "Let me guess," she muttered, not even looking up. "They're loving that little monologue of hers already, right?" The intern handing her the water looked away. Karoline stepped out of the studio moments later and was met with producer Nadine Calloway, standing just off camera, phone in hand. "We've already had 2 networks text about the segment," Nadine said. "One wants you on tomorrow morning." Karoline raised an eyebrow. "That fast?" Nadine showed her the phone screen. Karoline scrolled. Twitter, YouTube, TikTok. It was already spreading like wildfire. She recognized a few of the accounts. Not politicians, not activists. Regular users, teenagers, moms, teachers, people who didn't normally care about televised debates. One video was captioned, "Finally, someone who came with facts instead of fire." Jasmine emerged seconds later, phone to her ear. "No, I'm fine," she said. "No, it's not about that. She just caught everyone off guard with that martyr story. It's a trick. It's scripted." She paced. "I mean, the whole thing was rehearsed. You can tell." But what she couldn't tell, what no one had prepared her for, was that sometimes restraint isn't weakness. Sometimes it's exactly what cuts through the noise. Karoline tucked her notes into her bag. She didn't look smug. She didn't brag. She thanked the staff, shook hands with the crew, and walked slowly toward the elevators. Halfway down the hall, a junior researcher caught up to her. Hey, he said, a bit breathless. Just wanted to say that I was different. Like, it didn't feel like a debate. It felt like you were actually listening. Karoline smiled politely. Thanks, that was the point. Behind them, Jasmine's voice could still be heard as she vented into her phone. And she had the nerve to say, I don't know, struggle. Girl, please. I've been doing this longer than she's been legal. She didn't realize the hallway mics were still recording. Later that night, someone from the production crew would leak that audio. It wouldn't go viral in the same way, but it would spread. Enough for people to notice the contrast. Back on set, Greg sat in his chair, sipping cold coffee. He'd moderated dozens of these face-offs over the years, some louder, some messier, but rarely one that lingered like this. He looked at the cue sheet. They still had 7 minutes left in the segment after the break. He sighed. Well, he mumbled, good luck following that. But Karoline didn't need luck. The internet had already decided, and things were only picking up speed. By the time Karoline reached the parking garage, her phone was vibrating nonstop. Texts, mentions, screenshots, requests. She slid into the passenger seat of a black SUV, her assistant Molly behind the wheel. Molly had a look on her face somewhere between shock and amusement. You might want to check your notifications, she said, tapping the steering wheel with one finger. It's a bit much. Karoline unlocked her phone. The home screen was flooded. Clips from the panel had already splintered into 100 different edits. There were versions with dramatic music, versions slowed down for emphasis, and others overlaid with user reactions, gasps, laughs, stunned silence. One clip had already passed 1 million views in just under an hour. In the comments, something rare was happening. It wasn't just her supporters praising her. It was people from across the spectrum. Teachers, veterans, suburban parents, even young Gen Z users, sharing the clip and saying the same thing in different words. She didn't yell. She didn't mock. She just made sense. Molly read one aloud. This one says, I don't even agree with her politics, but wow. She handled that with class. Karoline didn't say anything at first. She just kept scrolling. She knew better than to get caught up in the praise, but something about the tone of it all felt different. It wasn't about winning. It was about how she showed up. Meanwhile, on Jasmine's end, things weren't going as smoothly. In the lobby of her hotel, she sat on the edge of a faux leather armchair, scrolling through reactions with growing irritation. That's not what happened, she whispered to herself, rewatching the clip. They cut out the context. She refreshed Twitter again. More of the same. Hashtags trending, hashtag Karoline crushed it, and had live TV mic drop. One video had already pulled in 50,000 likes in under 20 minutes. It froze on Jasmine's face the moment she tried to interrupt Karoline with the caption, when you realize facts don't care about your volume. It stung. She shot off a text to her comms director. We need to issue a statement or post something. This is spiraling. But it was already too late. The public had seen the exchange raw and unscripted. No filters, no edits. Just 2 women in real time, and one of them losing control. Back in the SUV, Karoline looked over at Molly. Has anyone from the network said anything? Molly nodded. They want you back on Friday. They said, and I quote, people actually listened for once. Karoline raised an eyebrow. That's new. Molly chuckled. Also, you're now trending ahead of the NBA playoffs, and some high school kid turned your quote into a ringtone. Karoline smiled, amused but still measured. She knew how fast the pendulum could swing, but still, this moment felt earned. Back in the studio, the night shift editors had already started cutting a full recap segment to air in the morning. One of the producers called it the cleanest takedown in years. Another editor muttered, she didn't just win, she rewrote the rules. But the biggest sign of impact came from an unexpected place. An AP government teacher in Mesa, Arizona, tweeted out a clip of the exchange with the caption, just showed this to my class, told them this is what it looks like when preparation beats performance. Within 2 hours, that tweet alone was quoted by nearly every major political commentator online, left, right, and independent. Commentators on YouTube rushed to post breakdowns. Even late-night hosts referenced it, some with jokes, others with grudging respect. And for once, viewers weren't just talking about the politics. They were talking about the tone, the control, the clarity. This wasn't just a viral clip. It had started to feel like a cultural moment. But while Karoline's stock was rising, Jasmine was quietly preparing her response, and it wasn't going to be graceful. 2 days later, the studio was quiet again, but this time, Karoline wasn't in the hot seat. She was sitting in a different building altogether, across from a host in a sleek morning news studio in Nashville. "Karoline, you've been on every major platform this week," the host said, smiling. "You've had 3 million new views on your debate clip. What do you think made it land the way it did?" Karoline took a breath. "I think people are starved for something real, not volume, not slogans, just someone who listens, answers, and doesn't take the bait." The host nodded slowly. "Were you surprised by Congresswoman Crockett's reaction?" Karoline gave the tiniest shrug. "No. That's what happens when people mistake disagreement for disrespect. But that's not my game." Across the country, Jasmine had canceled her scheduled appearance on a Saturday talk show in Tampa. Her office cited a scheduling conflict, though insiders confirmed it was about avoiding more questions about the viral moment. Her communications team had tried to control the narrative. They issued a press release claiming Karoline's response was emotionally manipulative and lacked legislative substance. But it didn't stick. One response from a retired school principal in Springfield summed up the public's reaction best. "If stating facts calmly is manipulation, then we've lost the plot." Meanwhile, professors were emailing the clip to colleagues. High school teachers added it to their digital civics lessons. A nonprofit in Omaha asked to license it for a video series on public discourse. Karoline wasn't celebrating. She was watching, studying the ripple. She knew this moment wouldn't last forever, but its lessons might. That night, she sat in her hotel room with a laptop balanced on her knees. A message from an old professor blinked on the screen. "Saw the clip. You didn't speak to win. You spoke to connect. Don't lose that." Karoline stared at it for a moment, then typed back, "That's the only way I know how." She meant it. The story kept building. Not just in headlines, but in quiet, private ways. A woman from Toledo posted a video with tears in her eyes, explaining how she'd always felt too intimidated to speak during PTA meetings. But after watching Karoline stand her ground with grace, she planned to raise her voice at the next one. A 17-year-old debate student in Flagstaff recreated the exchange for a classroom assignment, quoting Karoline word for word. Her teacher gave her full credit and added a note, "A masterclass in restraint." Even those who didn't agree with Karoline's policies couldn't ignore the impact. She wasn't louder, she was clearer, and that difference had echoed. Meanwhile, Jasmine held a private meeting with her core staff, demanding tighter message control going forward. She was angry, but not just at Karoline. She was angry at the reaction, at how quickly public opinion shifted, at how one exchange unraveled months of carefully curated media appearances. "What do I do?" she asked, voice low. "Go back on camera and pretend none of it happened?" Her strategist, a longtime DC insider, replied carefully, "You own it, or you bury it. But right now, ignoring it makes it worse." Jasmine didn't respond, but Karoline wasn't thinking about her. She was thinking about what came next. The lesson wasn't in the moment. It was in the pattern. You don't have to be the loudest to be heard. You just have to be the one who doesn't flinch when it counts. And that lesson had legs, but one final interview would bring everything full circle and make sure the message outlasted the moment. A week later, Karoline sat across from a quiet-spoken journalist named Teresa Langley on a small podcast based out of Bloomington, Indiana. It wasn't a flashy set, no lights, no makeup team, just 2 microphones, a coffee table, and a quiet room lined with books. Teresa pressed record and leaned forward. "Karoline, everyone's talked about that moment. They've dissected it from every angle. But I want to ask something different." Karoline looked up, curious. "When Jasmine Crockett interrupted you and you responded the way you did, was that instinct or preparation?" Karoline smiled, not smugly, but almost knowingly. "Both. You can't stay calm if you're not prepared, but you also can't fake calm. People see through it." Teresa nodded, adjusting her headphones. "There was something about how you said it. That line, you don't get to dismiss the truth just because you don't like who's saying it. It landed hard." Karoline took a moment before answering. "I think because it wasn't about her. It was about the habit we've all picked up lately of tuning people out based on what jersey they wear. Left, right, doesn't matter. If the facts are solid, they deserve to be heard. Teresa let the silence sit for a moment. Then, "Were you angry?" Karoline chuckled softly. "Sure, but anger doesn't always need a megaphone. Sometimes it just needs a sentence." That line would later appear on t-shirts, coffee mugs, and social posts for months. But in that room, it felt simple, unpolished, honest. Teresa ended the podcast with one last question. "What do you hope people take away from that night?" Karoline leaned in, thoughtful. "I hope they realize that control is power, that preparation beats flash, that you don't need to belittle someone to prove your point, and most of all, that restraint isn't weakness. It's the highest form of discipline." Teresa stopped the recording. For a second, they just sat there. "Thank you for that," she said quietly. Karoline nodded, stood up, and gathered her things. As she stepped out into the hallway, she passed a group of college interns huddled around a laptop. One of them whispered, "That's her." Another pulled up the video clip again, mouthing along to the quote. Karoline didn't stop. She didn't need to. Later that evening, she received a message from a teacher in San Antonio. It read, "Today, a student of mine used your debate response as an example in our class discussion on leadership. He said, she didn't try to win the fight. She just didn't let herself be dragged into one. That stuck with me." Karoline replied with a single sentence. "Sometimes the best way to win is by refusing to lower your voice." That moment had started as a televised clash, but it had become something more, a quiet blueprint for how to speak with strength when everyone else is shouting. In a world full of noise, Karoline had reminded people of something they'd nearly forgotten. Stillness cuts through chaos. If this story meant something to you, if you believe that reason matters more than reaction, hit that subscribe button. We've got more stories like this, and they're worth hearing.